Happy New Year's, everybody. It's January 2nd, 2016. I'm John Felt. Welcome to the Ag Weather Outlook. And we had quite a week. You might remember a week ago we started out with all these active watches and warnings across the country. One's for heavy rain, one's for heavy snow, one's for severe storms. But this is the current picture. Look how much quieter it is. So I guess that's one good thing as we go into the new year. Now you can see a couple green lines in there that correspond with rivers. We've had some major flooding, including record flooding near St. Louis and downstream from St. Louis on the Mississippi and its tributaries due to the very heavy rain. But overall, we're in a much quieter pattern as we start this week compared to last week. Here's another sign. Remember last week I showed you this temperature pattern that was sort of really bunched up there. We had the 60 degrees and 70 degrees, very close to the 20 degrees. Well, the current weather pattern is much more stable type pattern with relatively typical winter temperatures now across a large part of the nation. You can see in Iowa 17 degrees, and you go all the way down into Louisiana or Arkansas 20s and 30s. So once the temperature pattern becomes more standardized like that, uniform, we don't have the sign of a very strong low pressure system developing. So much more tranquil weather. But last week was a wild week. You could see the core in yellow is over 2 inches, in red is over 5 inches, and in the purple is nearly 10 inches. So extremely heavy rain that produced flooding from parts of Oklahoma, a small part of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, right up Interstate 44, then into the eastern Corn Belt, parts of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Now the southeast U.S., another week of very wet rain as well, especially southeast parts of Alabama, very large part of Georgia, and then into the western parts of the Carolinas. So very active week. Now the west central and the northern part of the region, there was some snow, some heavy snow as well on the northern edge, but over the Dakotas, for the most part, much quieter. Now, if you want to see the anomaly, this is the departure from normal. 1 week alone, 5-6 inches of rain more than would be normal in this band of extra rain. So just think of that. Even if you get normal rain for the next 5 or 6 months, we have enough surplus in those areas to go quite some time before we actually get into a deficit. So even if we would be in a modest deficit, let me put this a different way, an inch or so per month, it would be 6 months to work out this rain. So again, very heavy rainfall. Now, as far as snow goes, in the colder air with this system, remember that I sent out some information last week. This was bringing that moisture up from the Gulf of Mexico, some from the Pacific. Well, some of that got into the cold air, so consequently we got some snow, 6 to 9 inches of snow, or the dots in green, even above a foot of snow in the dots in blue, so parts of Iowa and surrounding states, Wisconsin. Pretty heavy snow last week with this strong area of low pressure. And much of it still remains on the ground. Here's the current snow depth, and we're starting to get a fairly significant snowpack over the upper Midwest. For this time of the year, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, you can see that sort of in that shade of generally between 4 and 10 inches of snow on the ground, some locally higher, some locally less. And if you want to see the water equivalent, we're starting to get a pretty decent water equivalent for this time of year. Look at the medium shades here. That's an inch of water equivalent. So we are beginning to get some notable water equivalent up in the upper Midwest right now. And, you might say, well, is that starting to work its way out? Well, look at the snow melt. This is the snow melt. You'd start to see shades of yellow and orange for rapid snow melt. There's really not much snow melt going on. So this is an accumulating snow. And I guess we're in January, so that is what you would expect. But it's been a while. This is the first time we're starting to see that accumulating snow. And I just wanted to mention that I don't see a whole lot of sign of change of this as we go forward with the type of pattern that we're in. On the other hand, I have to say I don't see a whole lot of additional extra snow in there. Most regions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. Now over the last week, here's your temperature departure. Very cold in the west. very mild in the east, and that's set up over the last week all the problems that we had. And one of the biggest problems was the flooding. Purple is indicating major flooding, and that's flooding roads, flooding structures. Red also significant flooding. So you can see the Illinois, Indiana rivers, the Mississippi River, tributaries further south. We're looking at very significant flooding. Also, fairly widespread flooding over parts of the southeast U.S., but generally not as the intensity of the middle Mississippi River Valley. Now, the Arctic Oscillation, I've talked about this a little bit over the last week or so, that we're seeing some changes. And you might remember that early in the season, I said the two things we want to look at are, first of all, an El Nino winter, which is a milder winter. But I also talked about the snow cover over Eurasia, and that there's some signs, especially in the last couple of years, that we could get into a negative Arctic oscillation in January and February, the brunt of winter. And there are some signs now that we're seeing that. So we've had our mild weather. We're seeing some signs. Now, the question I am not really ready to answer is how long that will last. But I am seeing some of that classic signs, and after being positive the entire season so far, the Arctic Oscillation is going negative. And that generally corresponds with colder than normal temperatures over the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, Northeast U.S., Mid-Atlantic, and then even parts of the South and Southeast U.S. So right now, this is a plot of the Arctic Oscillation, pretty much going to be dipping down there after the first week of this month, and then right through the middle of the month, maybe even late this month, predominantly negative. So when we look at the jet stream this week, here we go. We have a jet stream pattern that is going to show a beginning of a dip over the eastern U.S., not quite so pronounced this first week. Temperatures below normal over most regions, but not excessively so. We're looking at generally from maybe about 2 to about 8 degrees below normal. Other areas very close to normal. So it's not an extreme pattern. It's one that's going to feel like winter. Now, we've been mild for a long time, so you might say, well, man, this is unusually cold. Probably not. This is probably just more typical of what we see. But it does look like a fairly quiet week. We do have a light to moderate snow system later in the week over the upper Midwest, but for the most part, a much quieter week. This is what you see when you get this cold, stable air, light snow, but not the major systems that we saw like last week. The tracks of lows, really nothing of significance. So anything that we do get this week will be an upper system, lighter precipitation. So as far as precipitation goes, here's the next 7 days. There is some generally light or modest precipitation here and there, but best spots are going to be actually the west coast, and look at that, it's getting into the southern part of California, so there could be some drought relief in that region. When we look at anomalies for precipitation, I see a lot of yellow, and that's saying below normal precipitation. So a flip-flop here. Last week, we had well above normal precipitation in the eastern Corn Belt. This week, it's going to be well below normal. As far as snowfall forecast, there's going to be a smaller area, generally right in this region later this week, some modest snowfall. Doesn't look like it's going to be all that heavy, maybe 1 to 3 inches, 2 to 4 inches, but there could be some more. It's with an upper system pushing through. Okay, now this is when it starts to get a little bit more interesting. As we get towards the second and third week in January, look at this. The jet stream starts to dig further south over the central part of the U.S. We have this broad sinking of the jet stream that's associated with that negative Arctic oscillation, and we start to look at this pooling of cold air that starts to sink south. And this is getting more in the 10 to 12 degrees below normal. And at the time of the year, middle January, that's going to be pretty cold air. Then the 12th through the 17th, that dip in the jet stream pushes off to the east, and that's when we see a very widespread across the entire nation for the most part, but centered over the central part of the U.S., the unusually cold weather. So it's going to build in really near normal this week, next week a little bit more below normal, and probably right towards the middle of the month, we're going to really see this harsh type weather. Now, I don't necessarily think this is going to be accompanied by a lot of winter storms. It looks like it could just be cold and dry weather. One area I think we need to watch is the northeast U.S. with that warm water. Very possible we could get some lows off here, but over the Corn Belt, I think we're looking at more cold and quiet weather as we get right in the middle of the month. Now, like I said, I don't know yet if this is something that's going to go the rest of the winter or temporary. I'm looking at that. I should have some information on that soon. But right now, it does look like the early part of the winter, mild weather is going to be replaced by typical winter weather and even a bit colder than normal temperatures towards the middle of the month. So I think I've hit all my topics here. Much quieter week this week than last week. More typical winter type temperatures, below normal precipitation, but let's watch for that colder spell in the middle of the month. Happy New Year to everybody. I wish you all a great 2016. Hopefully you have a great planting and growing season this year and that I can help you out with that. Take care. Talk to you again next weekend.